Hi, everybody. I am Sam Marchiony, class of 18 from Oberlin. I just finished up my 2-year master's in theater studies at the University of Houston, and I was on AMTA's board from spring of 2015 to December 2017 when I graduated early. So it's been a while, but still much love for Oberlin and musicals in my heart. And this this workshop is based in part on the thesis that I was just working on at the University of Houston. So without further ado, let's get into it. First screen share, this is fun. Okay, so modern progressive musicals are the name I came up with for a genre, and I'm going to show you the 5 musicals that I used in my thesis to quantify this genre. And I'm going to take a sec, and I want you to think about what they have in common. So we have 2015's Hamilton, 2016's Natasha, Pierre, and the Great Comet of 1812, or just Great Comet for short, because we don't have that kind of time. Head Over Heels, Hadestown, and Six. So let's give it a couple of minutes. You can do this via chat. You can do this by unmuting your mic if you want, but I want to hear what you guys think is the right things in common that I'm looking for, because I do have specific things in mind. Feel like I should be doing Jeopardy music. Just to be sure, do you guys I can see either. Okay, I've seen one person in the chat. We do have, they all came out after 2000, and Veronica is right, but it's not one of the things that I'm looking for. So let's try to think about them as musicals, not just when they happened, but what they entail. Like if you were drawing a Venn diagram. Okay, Courtney says historical figures. Anyone else want to take a guess before I tell you my answers? Okay, Becky says at least 3 of them have death happen. Okay. So here's what I was looking for. Number 1, they all have some kind of modern musical genre associated with them. And I'll get into some specifics as we go along, but for now, let's talk about the other 3 things I was looking for. Number 2, they have some form of diverse casting. Again, I'm going to go into what this means because there is a very specific meaning of diverse casting when I say that. It's not as broad as you might think. Number 3, they have socially progressive messaging of some kind. They are pushing an agenda that, let's just say, would resonate at Oberlin on a typical Oberlin student. And number 4, they have an old subject matter. They are set in the past, usually 150 years older or so. So now I'm going to take you a little deeper into what each of these 4 categories, these 4 traits mean. But this isn't entirely new. We've seen musicals that kind of look like this in Miss Saigon, in Jesus Christ Superstar, in Rent, but I do not count these as modern progressive musicals because I don't perceive them as having all four of the traits that I mentioned, and I will explain why. I just want you to have these in your head as sort of a point of comparison so that I can help you understand what sets this new genre apart from the old similar works. So, modern music. Like I said, this is a modern genre. So you have things like pop and rap, rock and hip hop. And rock isn't exactly new, considering that you have jukebox musicals as having been a big part of Broadway. But, you know, Hamilton made a big deal out of how it was integrating modern music to sort of contrast with the old storytelling they were having. And it's not just about getting butts into seats for name recognition. It's not about being cool and with it. And how do you do, fellow kids? We're cool. Please like us. It's got some kind of specific theme to it. Six is my favorite example of this because Six uses very specific pop stars to go with each individual queen. So like Catherine of Aragon is very specifically based on Beyonce. She has a very Beyonce look to her, a very Beyonce sound. She even name drops Hold Up in her song No Way. I love her. I love all of them. Catherine Howard in the Pink, she's based on Ariana Grande, as you can kind of tell from the ponytail, and so on. So Six is the musical that's kind of taken this part of it to the most logical progression. But, you know, you also have Head Over Heels, which is a jukebox musical entirely made up of the Go-Go's songs. And the Go-Go's are a huge deal as being an all-female band who reached a critical level of success. Very, very specific music having a very specific meaning for each musical. That's a big part of this. And so now we go into diverse casting and a side quest. So I'm going to assume that you guys have all heard the term colorblind casting at some point in your lives, and I've heard it too, I've used it too, but it's actually one of 4 categories that were introduced as inclusive casting types by a theater maker called Joni Lee Jones in 1987. And so colorblind is probably the one that you're most familiar with. It's where the best performer gets the role regardless of their race or ethnicity. My favorite example of this, the 1997 Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella. Why does a Black woman marrying a white man produce a Filipino son? I don't know. I don't care. This cast is amazing and I love it. Gold stars. Mwah. I'm so mad it's not on Disney Plus. So from here, we get into categories you might not have heard of. We have cross-cultural, which is where you take a play out of its original setting and move it into a new one. So if we go to old school Shakespeare, this production about Much Ado About Nothing from the Public Theater took the play from its 1500s, 1600 Messina, Sicily setting and moved it to Georgia and gave it an all-Black cast to give it a new spin. And yes, Stacey Abrams, 2020, they called it. Mwah, love it. Okay, number 3 is societal casting. And this is where you cast minority actors similar to the ones they play in society. So the best way I can sum this up is when you hire an actual trans person, hi Laverne Cox, to play a trans person, rather than, say, calling up Eddie Redmayne. Don't. Just don't. That's not what we're here for. And finally, we have conceptual casting, which is about casting an actor from a minority group to increase the resonance or create a new meaning for the role. We have, as an example, Kyle Scatliff playing Enjolras in the most recent Broadway revival of Les Mis, because it hits differently when you hear a Black man singing, "It is the music of a people who will not be slaves again." Or we have Katrina Lenk in the sadly not happening right now revival of Company playing Bobby, which rearranges all of the pressure Bobby is feeling about relationships and love, because those expectations in society are different for a woman. So, how does this all connect back to modern progressive musicals? Well, modern progressive musicals sport a blend of conceptual and colorblind. So, like, you have the Hamilton cast, which is very specifically diverse. They have a specific concept in mind with having people of color play these white historical figures, but there's no requirement that Eliza be played every single time by an Asian actress like Philippa Sue is. When I saw Hamilton, I saw Crystal Joy Brown as Eliza. She was gorgeous and I loved her. But you can have arguably any actor of color in the roles designated for actors of color, so long as you're keeping to that consistent vision Lin-Manuel Miranda had of America then by America now. You see something similar in Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, which is a little more laissez-faire in that we have that unfortunate casting controversy that sunk Great Comet. May it shine forever in the stars, because they tried to replace Okidore Onawadon with Mandy Patinkin. I'm cool. But again, it was a big deal to have a diverse cast, to have Danae Benton playing the ingenue. Becky feels me on the Great Comet thing. Ugh. I know. Hadestown, again, mostly a colorblind cast, but there's still some specific choices in there. The role of Hermes is now pretty explicitly linked with blackness and gayness, thanks to Andre DeShield's amazing Tony-winning turn. And it's kind of on the nose that Patrick Page is one of only a few white figures, and he's playing the somewhat evil capitalist destructive force. And 6, as I mentioned, has those specific pop stars referencing. So you kind of see that in the casting. Like Jane Seymour, who's in the white on the far side, is typically played by white actresses because she's in large part based on Adele. You tend to have Black women playing Catherine of Aragon, again, for that Beyonce connection. You have Black women playing Anne of Cleves in the red because she's inspired by Nicki Minaj and Rihanna. But they're starting to branch out and get more into firmly colorblind territory. I think at this point, Catherine Parr, who's in the blue over here, is the only character who's been across all productions consistently played by an actress of color, whereas every other role has had some variation of white actresses and actresses of color throughout the various productions. So that's our little journey into casting. Next step is pointing out that this casting point is why Miss Saigon doesn't count, because you have to have Asian actors playing the Asian parts. Do not do yellowface in Miss Saigon. And maybe don't do Miss Saigon at all, because I have... we don't have time to get into my feelings on Miss Saigon. Just know that I don't like it. And Jesus Christ Superstar is basically an open buffet for colorblind casting, which could trip into conceptual if the director has a specific vision, but it wasn't written specifically to be for actors of color. It wasn't written with this particular concept in mind. Rent, like Miss Saigon, has some specific identities that you can't really wiggle out of. Mimi has to be Latina. And I mean, it's been a while since I looked at the script, so I don't know if it's like a written requirement in there that Collins be Black or that Joanne be Black, but it's typically accepted that certain parts in Rent are played by actors of color. So that's why I don't really consider them to be in the same boat casting-wise as what I've been defining as the modern progressive musical. All right, now moving on to the socially progressive messaging. Because of the specific casting that happens in these musicals, you have that underlying current of representation matters, but you also see some issues getting a little more attention depending on what the musical is and what they're trying to go for. Head Over Heels, which is, I'm going to guess, the one that you guys haven't heard about, because sweet musical that it is, it came and went very quickly. It got no awards attention, and a lot of people didn't know what to make of it, but it was big on themes of gender and beauty and romance. It had a wonderful onstage lesbian kiss, and it was also the first musical on Broadway to have a transgender performer originating a role. If you've ever seen RuPaul's Drag Race and you know Peppermint originated a role called Pythio, which was in the text non-binary, and it was a big deal. I saw Head Over Heels right before it closed. Everybody lost their minds whenever Peppermint came on stage. She was fantastic. Hadestown has a lot of environmental themes. It also has a lot of Marxist themes in terms of talking about the relationship between capitalism and oppression. And Six's messaging is grounded in feminism. It takes a lot of approaches to feminism, talking about things like sexual harassment and conditioning, and mostly it's about the patriarchal lens of how women are perceived and treated, but it's a very consistent message that gets worked into the text in a lot of different ways. And it's still my favorite thing ever. I am so salty that they do not get to be represented at the Tonys this year. The Tonys this year are so weird. And so finally, we get to our old subject matter. So in case you didn't know, we have American history for Hamilton, Russian 19th century Russian literature for Great Comet, 17th century, I want to say, no, 16th century Elizabethan prose poem from England for Head Over Heels, Greek mythology for Hadestown, and 16th century English history for Six. And this is what I might say are the problem spots, because if you look at these, all these source materials are fairly white and they're fairly dominated by a patriarchal lens that, you know, kind of limits the worldview. And I think there's both an argument for and against that, but we will get into that towards the end of this. I just want to show you a few other highlights that are, I think, indicative of the fact that this genre is not going away anytime soon. So in Massachusetts, we had a brief run of the Great Comet team, Dave Malloy composing and Rachel Chavkin directing. They came together to do Moby Dick. It was 3 hours long. They had so many genres and they were trying to cover everything. Like, they had environmentalism messages and they had messages about representation mattering in the here and now. They had at one point an actor just stopped the show cold to do like a 10-minute monologue about how colorblind casting was affecting him, and they did a land acknowledgement. They did so much stuff in 3 hours. It made my brain hurt. But it was also like, it's Dave Malloy and Rachel Chavkin, so it's always gonna be intensely beautiful, even if it's a little messy. I loved it. We also have over in London And Juliet. It's another jukebox musical with songs by composer Max Martin, who's written for like every pop star ever. So you have like Backstreet Boys songs, Katy Perry songs, Britney Spears songs, and it's all about Juliet changing the ending of Romeo and Juliet and going off to find herself. Again, we have messages of feminist self-discovery. We have explorations of gender identity and a lot of fun with pop songs. It won a couple of Olivier Awards this year from their own weird truncated theater season, but lost out on Best Musical to Dear Evan Hansen. No comment. And Broadway was also supposed to be seeing Once Upon a One More Time, which is a Britney Spears jukebox musical that's about the Disney princesses learning feminist theory from the feminine mystique. Oh my God, I wanted it. I wanted it so badly, and we didn't get it. So, like I said, there are a couple of problem spots with this. We have source materials that are majority white kind of reinforce that knowledge of Western white stories are universal. These are the stories that everybody should tell, and no one's really raising their hand like, hey, maybe we could incorporate stories that are told by Black people or Indigenous people or people of color. Can we do that? And it's also kind of homogenous behind the scenes. Like, you have a lot of talented performers of color on stage, but there aren't as many behind the scenes. Thomas Kail, I don't know specifically what his ethnic background is, but he passes for white at the very least. Rachel Chavkin has pointed out herself that she's a white woman, and so that puts her pretty far up on the totem pole, even if she is still somewhat at a disadvantage because of the woman thing. Head Over Heels had Michael Mayer, who's also white. They also had two white guys who I believe are married to women writing the libretto, which feels a little weird when your main libretto is about queer love. And Toby Marlowe and Lucy Moss for 6, both white. One of them is gay, one of them is a woman, but there's still that dominating whiteness to this. And, you know, I'd like to see more people of color getting into this in the future. So that is your very truncated crash course on what the modern progressive musical is. This isn't really a widely accepted term yet within musical theater scholarship, which is a teeny tiny pond of scholarship, but I'm hoping that maybe one day it will be something that catches on. So I'm going to open it up for questions from you guys if you want to ask me anything, but I also have a question that you don't have to answer right now, but maybe you want to think about it, because AMTA is not just about performing musicals, it's about thinking about what kind of musicals you want to see. So now that you know what a modern progressive musical is, what does yours look like? What's a story that you think could benefit from this genre? And you don't have to go and fix the problem spots that I identified. If you want to, you absolutely can, but there's still absolutely merit in the genre the way it's working now. And that's all I wrote. Thank you. And I'm ready for questions now if you guys want to open it back up. Anybody? How much research was required for this? 2 years of a graduate program, and I started writing specifically last year. The end result of my thesis was about 200 pages long, including my bibliography. The 200 pages was well, first I walked through like all 4 of the musicals, and then the rest of it is just a deep dive into 6. Like, I had a full-on 6 conspiracy board at one point. But yeah, this was a 2-year program that, honestly, this was how I spent most of my quarantine. Don't go to grad school unless you really like writing. And even if you really like writing, maybe don't go to grad school, because it will take all the joy out of it. Okay, Calvin's saying, I missed the beginning, so I might have already said this. Do original concepts count, or only reimagination/retellings? It's, in my opinion, it has to be a retelling, because I think that's sort of a grander philosophical thing to it, is that you're trying to take something from our past and make it relatable to the future. You can absolutely take creative liberties with it. And I think the modern progressive musicals that make the most changes are the ones that are doing better. Like, I love Head Over Heels, deeply flawed, but I love how it tries so hard to bring in dialogue about gender identity and sexuality. Like, I loved seeing this gorgeous plus-sized actress being hailed as gorgeous, and I loved seeing an interracial lesbian kiss, and I loved seeing somebody discover their own gender fluidity through the art of drag. It was nothing like the prose poem that it's based on, The Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, but it didn't have to be good. So that answer kind of got away from me, but it's like, you do need something to ground it in the familiar to your audience. And I think that's another reason why the white Western narratives tend to grab the most focus, because they're where the primary musical theater audiences are valued, let's say. Like, at the end of the day, you're selling to Scott Rudin or to the Nederlander group. You're selling to predominantly white producers who are like, are my rich New York friends going to come see this? So yeah, it's disappointing, but it's also capitalism. Does anyone else want to go? Are there any musicals that show the viewpoint of the indigenous people in America? Because I think that'd be cool. I'd have to take another look. I haven't found a lot in my research. I can absolutely recommend Starry, the musical. It's not from the perspective of an indigenous person because it's about Vincent van Gogh, but it has a native librettist, Kelly Lynn D'Angelo. I am blanking on her tribal nation, but she is an absolute delight, and I absolutely recommend that. I also recommend Randy Reinhold's Off the Rails, which is sort of a musical, but it has no cast recording, so I couldn't really access it for research purposes. But what it is a version of William Shakespeare's Measure for Measure that's set out in the Wild West, and it's changed to make the characters of Claudio and Isabella into native people who have been civilized / culturally genocided through the re-education centers that the United States used to stamp out native culture. They have a lot to do with existing as social pariahs now that they've been alienated from their own culture while also still being othered in white culture. And that, I've only read the script for it, but it was definitely something worth reading. And we do absolutely need a lot more indigenous people represented in the industry in general. And yeah, that is absolutely something that would be cool to see in the future.
Okay, I think that probably concludes the question portion.
Okay, yep.
I
think right. So too, but I had a great time.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting together this presentation. Thank you to everybody for coming. Yeah. So it's a good time. This is our Ampta's second workshop, barring the spooky movie musical watching we did last week.
Oh, I missed that.
Yeah. Yeah. But we have 2 more workshops for the rest of this year. Next week is the musical themes and motifs of Frankenstein, a new musical, and then the week after that is, I believe, how to audition for an Ampta musical. So keep an eye out for both of those on, Facebook, emails, Instagram. But yeah, thank you so much again, Sam, for coming and putting this workshop together.
Thanks for having me.
It was a good time.
Everybody stay safe out there. Keep washing your hands and wearing a mask. Because we want
important.
Broadway back.
Yeah. All right.
God,
have a good night, everybody.